12 people rode into the Okefenokee Swamp on a clear morning in 1892, dressed in their Sunday best and carrying enough food and flowers to host a wedding. They were headed for one of the interior islands the family knew by heart, planning to celebrate the ceremony and return home before the sun went down that evening. 3 days later, a search party found the table floating in open water, with the food still sitting on it and the plates still set for a meal. There were no boats to be found, and no bodies in the water, nor was there any torn clothing or a single sign that anything had gone wrong at all. 12 people do not just vanish into thin air without leaving a trace behind. And that leaves us with the question of what actually happened to them. Before you can understand what happened to the Dial Party, you need to understand what the Okefenokee actually is, because it is not a swamp in the way most people picture one. The place covers about 700 square miles of black water and floating vegetation across the Georgia-Florida border. And even today, most of it is only accessible by flat-bottomed boat through channels that shift with the seasons. Inside the interior, the cypress canopy grows so thick that the midday light looks like late afternoon, and you can lose your sense of direction in less than an hour. The name itself tells you something about the landscape, as Okefenokee likely comes from a Hitchiti word meaning trembling earth, which is a literal description of how the ground behaves. Most of what looks like solid earth in the swamp is actually decomposing vegetation and peat that has built up over thousands of years into thick, floating mats. When you step on these mats, the whole surface moves under your feet because there is open water beneath you, sometimes just a few feet, and sometimes much more. By 1892, the United States government had already tried and mostly failed to map the interior of the swamp. A drainage survey in the 1880s went in with the goal of turning the land into farms, but the surveyors came back with incomplete records and a warning to leave the place alone. The channels never matched the charts from one season to the next, and islands that were there in the spring would simply be gone or moved by the fall. The Seminole and Creek communities who knew this land longest treated the interior with a specific kind of respect that was not quite fear, but a recognition that the deep swamp was different from the edges. Certain areas were strictly off-limits, and that was not based on superstition, but on generations of accumulated knowledge about a terrain that could kill you without warning. The physical mechanics of the swamp work against you in layers, starting with the water that is stained almost black from tannins leaching out of the decaying peat. In that water, your visibility drops to almost nothing, and objects that go under do not come back up easily because the chemistry of the water slows the natural processes that would normally float a body to the surface. Old swampers used to talk about batteries, which are dense tangles of cypress roots just beneath the waterline that can catch a boat hull or a leg and never let go. The floating peat mats can also collapse suddenly and silently, pulling everything on the surface straight down into the dark water below. Into this place, on a clear morning in 1892, a family loaded their boats with food and flowers and rowed toward the interior to celebrate a wedding. The Dial family had lived in Charlton County for generations, and they were the kind of people who appear in county records not because they held high office, but because they were simply everywhere. You find their names on land deeds, in church registries, and listed as witnesses on the documents of every neighbor for miles. Swamp Edge families in southeastern Georgia in the 1890s built their lives around a very specific set of skills, and the Dials were masters of that world. They spent their days hunting, trapping, and fishing the Blackwater channels, while growing just enough on the higher ground to get through the winter. They were a large, rooted, and ordinary family who knew the Okefenokee the way you know the back of your own hand. In 1892, the family gathered for a wedding when one of the Dial daughters decided to join her life to another family from that same stretch of Swamp Edge. It was the kind of union that happened constantly in isolated rural communities, where everyone already knew everyone else. And the accounts that survive today do not preserve all the names consistently. Because the details often differ between sources, we should hold the specific names loosely, but the records do agree on the number of people involved. 12 people made the trip into the swamp that morning, including the bride and groom, members of both families, and a few close neighbors. By the standards of the time and place, it was a complete wedding party. They were not going very far into the interior because there was a peat island deep in the swamp that the Dial family knew well. These islands had flat, stable surfaces that were open enough to set up a table and chairs, yet they were surrounded by water that provided a particular kind of privacy. They served as natural gathering spots for people who understood the swamp well enough to navigate there and back in a single day. The party traveled in flat-bottomed skiffs, which was the only practical way to move through the Okefenokee, as a flat-bottomed skiff draws almost no water. This design allowed them to slide over the thick mats of submerged vegetation that would stop a deeper boat cold. And you do not row these boats so much as you pole them. They loaded those skiffs with everything a celebration required, including food prepared ahead of time, a folding table, chairs, and flowers for decoration. It was a complete setup for a meal on the water, and they likely even had a few bottles of something to toast the couple. The morning they left was clear and bright, and this detail appears in every account that exists, because it rules out the easiest explanations for what followed. Nobody pushed off into a gathering storm, and nobody misjudged the coming weather, which meant the sky was open and the air was warm. The cypress corridors were lit up in a way that made the Okefenokee look like the most beautiful place in Georgia, rather than the most dangerous. Family members and neighbors stood on the bank and watched the boats move into the tree line until they disappeared, which was exactly how these trips were supposed to go. You watched them go, you expected them back by dark, and if they decided to stay the night on the island, you simply expected to hear the stories when they got home the next morning. Nobody on shore had any reason to worry, because the Dials knew that swamp better than anyone, and the people on the bank went back to their daily chores and waited for the evening to bring the party home. The last person to see the wedding party was standing on the bank of a channel leading into the interior. And while accounts differ on who this person was, they all agree on what was seen. The party was rowing in good spirits into the cypress corridor, and the sound of their voices carried back across the water for a minute or two before the tree line closed behind them and the water went quiet. By evening, the boats had not come back. This was not immediately alarming to the people waiting on shore, because these trips often ran long when the food was good and the company was better. It was easy to imagine the group getting comfortable on the island, or perhaps the weather was simply too nice to pack up and pole home in the fading light. It was reasonable to assume they had stayed the night and would return in the morning full of stories about the celebration, so the people on shore went to sleep. Morning came, but there were no boats on the water, and no sound of voices came from the channels. This is where the waiting turned into something much heavier, as a second full day passed without any sign of the group, and no skiff nosed out of the tree line. There was no voice calling from the water, and no smoke from a campfire visible above the cypress tops. And by the end of that second day, the mood on shore had shifted from mild concern into a fear that did not have a name yet. On the third morning, the community put together a search party made up of men from the surrounding area who knew the swamp well enough to go in. They brought poles for probing the water, guns for signaling, and enough supplies to stay out for days if necessary, as these were men who had grown up poling these same channels. They had their own mental maps of the interior, built from years of hunting and trapping, so they were not going in blind. However, a mental map of the Okefenokee is only partially reliable because the swamp is constantly revising itself. Channels that ran straight in one season often developed oxbows by the next, and a peat island that sat in a particular place last summer might have drifted 20 yards or vanished entirely by spring. The searchers went in with knowledge that was real but incomplete, and they worked through the channels methodically while calling out and firing shots into the air. They watched the water ahead for any sign of the party, but for hours they found absolutely nothing. There was not a boat to be seen, and they found no piece of clothing snagged on a cypress knee. No sound answered their calls, and the swamp did what it does best, which is hold its surface perfectly still and offer no answers. Then they found the table. It was floating in open water, in a part of the swamp where the channel widened out into one of the small prairies, the kind of open stretch where a peat island would sit exposed on all sides. The table was upright. It wasn't tipped, it wasn't half submerged, and it wasn't spinning slowly in the current. It sat perfectly level on the black water's surface, as if the water were a floor, looking exactly the way you would set it for a meal in your own dining room. The food was still on it. That detail gets repeated in every version of this story, because it's the one that refuses to make sense no matter how long you sit with it. Plates were set, and the meal was laid out, whatever the Dial family had brought in for the wedding celebration. And these were people who would have prepared carefully for an occasion like this, who would have carried their best dishes and their best food. It was still there, arranged and undisturbed. The flowers were there too, still upright in whatever vessel they'd been placed in. No boats were anywhere in the water around it. The searchers spread out and pulled through every channel they could reach, checking every cypress stand where a skiff might have drifted and lodged against the roots. They probed the water with their poles along the perimeter of the area, pushing down into the dark water to feel for anything solid below the surface. They called out names, and they fired their guns, and they listened for an answer. The shots echoed flat across the prairie and came back off the tree line and faded. And nothing answered. There was no torn clothing on the cypress knees, and no hat floating in a backwater. No debris of any kind suggested the kind of chaos that follows when something goes suddenly and badly wrong on the water. The surface was clean, which in its own way was worse than finding wreckage, because wreckage at least tells you a story. A clean surface tells you nothing. The table had to have gotten into the water somehow, and there were only two ways it could have managed it. Either someone put it there deliberately, which made no sense as an explanation because there was no one left to ask why, or the island it had been sitting on went under, and the table floated free. That second option is physically possible because wood floats, but it raises an immediate question about everything else that should have floated too. The search went on for as long as the men could sustain it. They covered the surrounding area as thoroughly as the channels allowed, which was not thoroughly enough, because the Okefenokee doesn't allow thorough. There were sections they couldn't reach without risking their own boats in the batteries, sections where the vegetation was too dense to pole through, and sections where the water was deep enough that probing with a pole got you nothing useful. Eventually, the search contracted back toward the edges. Eventually, the searchers came out of the swamp, and the swamp closed behind them. What the physical evidence told them, taken straight and without interpretation, was this. The party reached the interior, they set up their celebration, something happened, and the table was the only thing left. What the evidence didn't tell them was any part of the sequence that connected the celebration to the floating table. There was no moment of crisis, and no direction in which the people went. There was no sign that anyone had fought the swamp, or run from it, or called for help. The absence of struggle evidence is its own kind of evidence, and what it suggests is either that whatever happened was too fast for struggle, or that the struggle happened somewhere the searchers couldn't reach. The search ended without resolution. The story passed into local record, and the question of what actually happened to 12 people on a clear morning in 1892 moved from a crisis into a mystery, which is where it has stayed ever since. To understand what the swamp could have done to 12 people in a single morning, you need to understand what it was doing to people on a regular basis, quietly and without ceremony, all through the back half of the 1800s. Start with the thing that makes the most physical sense as an explanation. Battery collapse. A battery, in the old swampers' vocabulary, was a dense formation of cypress roots and accumulated peat sitting just beneath or at the waterline. They weren't stable platforms. They were compressed organic material that had been building for decades, and under the right conditions, the wrong weight or the wrong distribution of pressure, they gave way. Not always with a crack or a groan, sometimes with almost no sound at all, just a slow settling and then a drop, the surface folding inward like a cloth being pulled from underneath. The floating peat islands were the same principle at a larger scale. They were not anchored to anything. Below the mat, the water could run 30 feet deep or deeper in places, cold and dark, and carrying almost no oxygen near the bottom. When an island went under, it didn't go slowly like a ship listing to one side. The better comparison is to a trap door. The mat reaches a tipping point, and the whole surface folds and submerges within seconds. Whatever was on top of it goes with it, or into the water beside it, and the water closes over almost immediately. By 1892, the alligator population in the Okefenokee was among the densest in North America. A federal survey conducted in 1907, 15 years after the dial party disappeared, counted thousands of animals in the interior, and that count came after decades of hunting pressure had already reduced the population from what it had been. In 1892, the numbers were higher. These were not animals at the edge of their habitat. They were the dominant predator in a closed ecosystem. And the interior prairies were exactly the kind of open, warm, shallow water they preferred. A person in the water in the Okefenokee in 1892 was not in water where alligators were occasionally present. They were in the alligator's living room. Water moccasins, which most of the country calls cottonmouths, were present in concentrations that early surveyors flagged specifically in their reports. The word one 1880 survey used was alarming, and that word came from men who were themselves experienced in southern waterways and not given to dramatic language about snakes. The moccasin is a heavy-bodied, aggressive pit viper that hunts along the water's surface, that doesn't retreat the way most snakes do, and that is comfortable moving across floating vegetation the same way it moves through water. If a group of people was suddenly in the water, thrashing and disturbing the vegetation mats around them, moccasins in those numbers would have been part of the immediate environment. Then there's the water chemistry itself, which works against recovery in a way that isn't intuitive until you understand it. The tannins we mentioned earlier don't just stain the water, they acidify it, and that acidity, combined with low oxygen levels and cold temperatures deeper down, slows bacterial decomposition significantly. A body that goes under in the Okefenokee doesn't behave the way a body in a river or a lake behaves. The gases that would normally accumulate and bring remains to the surface take much longer to develop. In some conditions, they don't develop at all. The swamp can retain what it takes. And then there's the disorientation, which is harder to quantify, but just as fatal. The interior of the Okefenokee offered almost no fixed landmarks to navigate by. The cypress stands looked identical from every angle. The channels curved and split and dead-ended into vegetation. Experienced swampers, men who'd spent their lives in that water, got turned around for days in the interior. A group of people, suddenly in the water, separated from their boats, would have had almost no way to determine which direction led toward the edge. Put all of that together, the collapse, the water, the animals, the chemistry, the disorientation, and you have a place that was capable of taking 12 people and leaving behind nothing but a table. But that explanation has a problem. The peat collapse theory is the most physically coherent explanation anyone has offered for what happened to the Dial Party. And it makes sense, because the swamp had the mechanism, the history, and the capacity to swallow them whole. But when you put the theory against the specific evidence the searchers actually found, the logic starts pulling apart at the seams. Begin with the boats. Flat-bottomed skiffs do not sink when a peat island goes under, and because they are made of wood and designed to be hollow, they are meant to float on swamp water while carrying heavy loads. If the island collapsed and pulled the party into the water, The skiffs would have stayed on the surface, where they might have drifted or been pushed sideways by the disturbance. The search party found nothing, and since no boat was tucked into a battery and no hull was drifting in the channels, the boats are just as absent as the people. Wood simply does not go under with a peat mat. Then there is the question of survival time. The Okefenokee interior is covered in floating vegetation mats, which is the same kind of surface the party had been sitting on before they vanished. If 12 people went into the water at the same time, the instinct for anyone who could swim would be to reach for the nearest mat or the nearest cypress root. You do not have to be a strong swimmer to grab a surface and stay up. And 12 people thrashing in open water creates a noise that experienced swampers working nearby channels would have heard. No survivor made it to the edges, and no one came out of the water in a neighboring channel the following morning, which is a ratio that a straightforward collapse does not fully account for. No bodies ever surfaced. Not in the days immediately after, not in the weeks that followed, and not in any record that survives from the months and years that came after. We already know the swamp water chemistry slows decomposition, so the absence of bodies in the first week is explainable, but complete, permanent non-recovery across all 12 individuals is a different matter. Even in the Okefenokee, remains occasionally surfaced in neighboring areas, yet none associated with the Dial Party ever did. And then there is the table itself, which is the part that keeps resisting the simple answer, no matter which angle you come at it from. If the island dropped suddenly in the middle of the meal, the contents of that table would not have stayed arranged on its surface, because a sudden drop into water tips things and sloshes liquid. What the searchers described was a table with food still set on it, intact, as if someone had just stepped away for a moment. For that condition to result from a collapse, the drop would have had to be so gradual and so perfectly level that every item stayed in place as the island went under and the table floated free. That is not impossible, but it is a specific and unlikely sequence. The alternative reading of the table's condition, that it was placed on the water deliberately after the meal, raises questions the record offers no purchase on at all. Placed by whom? For what reason? After what event? Some neighbors, interviewed in the days after the search ended, said they thought they had heard shouting from the direction of the swamp on the first evening. They had assumed it was celebration noise, toasts and laughter carrying across the water, and they had not paid it particular attention. That detail, small and uncertain as it is, suggests the party may still have been alive at dusk. Without boats, without bodies, and without witnesses, the record closes. Rumor in a small county moves the way water moves in a swamp, finding the lowest ground and pooling there until it cannot leave. Within weeks of the search party coming out empty-handed, the story of the Dial Party was already changing. Not because anyone was lying, exactly, but because that is what happens when a true event has no resolution. The human mind does not tolerate an open ending well, so it fills the gap with whatever is available, which, in Charlton County in the 1890s, meant the accumulated weight of every other bad thing the Okefenokee had ever done to someone. The number of victims shifted depending on who was telling the story. In some versions, it was 12, in others, fewer, and in others, more. The names changed or disappeared entirely. The date grew vague. One version placed the wedding in a different season, while another added a storm that was not in any original account. Each retelling smoothed out some specific detail and replaced it with something that fit the shape of the story better, making it feel more like a complete narrative and less like a series of unanswered questions. But one detail never changed across any version: the table. That is worth sitting with for a moment. Folklore is remarkably good at dissolving the particulars of a true event, like the names and the faces, but it tends to preserve the image that started the whole thing. The table, floating on black water, with the food still set, is too strange and too specific to be the kind of image someone invents. You invent danger, you invent a monster, or you invent a storm, but you do not invent a set table floating undisturbed in open water, because that image does not serve a conventional story. It just sits there and refuses to mean anything clean. The swamp had a reputation in the surrounding region long before 1892 that the Dial disappearance folded into and amplified. Hunters and trappers who worked the edges talked about the interior with a particular kind of careful respect, and people went in and did not come out often enough that it had stopped being news in any individual case. The Dial party was different only in scale, as 12 people at once was a number that could not be quietly absorbed into the general category of swamp deaths. The Seminole communities, who had the longest relationship with the Okefenokee, carried their own knowledge of the interior in a form that does not translate neatly into written records. Specific areas were treated as places you did not go, not as folklore in the dismissive sense, but as practical instruction passed across generations by people whose survival depended on accurate information about the terrain. The interior sections associated in that tradition with dangerous ground correspond, when you map them against what we now know about the swamp geology, with the areas of greatest peat instability. That is not a coincidence. It is what accumulated knowledge about an environment actually looks like before anyone writes it down in a survey report. By the early 1900s, the story appeared occasionally in regional newspapers, referenced as local legend, which is a category that sits uncomfortably between history and invention. Once a true event gets labeled legend, people stop looking for the documentation. The Charlton County Courthouse, the church registries, and the private letters that might have named the dead were never searched with urgency because the story had already been reclassified as something that did not require proof. The swamp, meanwhile, kept doing what it had always done. The Dial party was not the first group of people the Okefenokee swallowed, but they were certainly the largest. Before 1892, the disappearances usually entered the record the way individual deaths in isolated places always do, appearing as a name noted in a county ledger, or a family that simply stopped expecting someone to walk through the door. Hunters and trappers, working the interior channels during the 1860s and 1870s, accounted for a handful of these lost souls. These were men who knew the swamp well enough that nobody questioned them going in, yet they simply did not come back out, and their remains were never found. Each disappearance was absorbed into the general understanding that the Okefenokee took a toll, and that working close to it carried a cost that was sometimes final. The 1875 Drainage Survey produced the most formally documented example before the Dial case began. A crew was sent into the interior to see if they could channel out the swamp's water for agriculture and development, because people kept looking at the Okefenokee and imagining it emptied and productive. Somewhere near the center of the swamp, the survey team lost 2 men. The official records note their absence, but they do not record the recovery of any remains, because there were none to find. The crew eventually emerged short 2 members, and the final project report recommended against further interior work without significant additional resources, which was just a polite way of writing that the swamp had demonstrated its position on the matter. By the early 1900s, the interior around Billy's Island had been transformed into a massive logging operation. The Hebbard Lumber Company ran crews in there starting around 1909 to cut the old-growth cypress that had been standing since before Georgia was even a state. The loggers built a small settlement on Billy's Island that included houses, a commissary, and a railroad to move the timber out to the world. Their accounts of the ground are specific in ways that drainage survey reports never were, because these were men interacting with the peat surface every single day. They dragged heavy equipment across it and watched how the earth responded to the pressure. They described ground that moved under their feet. It did not just tremble lightly, the way the swamp's outer edges did, but it shifted and sank under heavy loads in ways that swallowed equipment outright. If a log skidder sat in one place for too long, the machine would begin to sink into the earth. Sections of railroad track had to be relocated because the ground beneath them settled overnight while the workers slept. Men reported areas where the surface simply would not hold weight, where probing with a pole found no bottom within reach, and where the peat mat was floating on water deep enough that nothing driven into it would ever anchor. Federal survey work from the same period put some hard numbers to what the loggers were describing by feel. Peat mats floating on water measured between 15 and 30 feet deep in various sections of the interior. This was not 15 to 30 feet of solid peat, but rather 15 to 30 feet of open water trapped beneath the mat. The vegetation sat on top of the depths like a thin skin on a bowl of soup. That is the floor the Dial family set their table on. So let's go back to the table, because the table is the only physical object anyone actually recovered from this event, and it deserves to be treated as evidence rather than atmosphere. Nobody recorded what happened to it after the searchers found it in the water, whether someone pulled it out and brought it to shore, or whether it eventually waterlogged and sank. The record does not say. This is a strange absence in the story. You would expect a family that had just lost 12 people to want the table back, or to at least note what became of the last thing they touched. The silence around the table's fate after discovery is almost as complete as the silence around the people who sat at it. What the accounts do preserve is the condition of the furniture at the moment of finding, and that condition is the thing that makes every physical explanation feel uncomfortable. The food was still arranged on the surface. The plates were in their proper places. The table was floating perfectly upright. The two types of peat collapse the logging crews documented produce very different outcomes for anything sitting on the surface when the earth gives way. A slow subsidence is the kind where the mat settles gradually over minutes or even hours, and that would have given the party plenty of time to react. They would have felt the ground softening beneath them and seen the water rising around the table legs. People in that situation move. They grab the boats, they push toward the edges of the island, and they try to get their weight off the sinking section of the mat. A slow collapse, followed by the table floating free, would almost certainly have left the food disturbed, because people moving in a panic do not leave everything in its place. A sudden drop is a cleaner explanation for the intact food, because there would have been no time to disturb anything before the surface vanished. But a sudden drop is also a violent event. The displacement of water when a large peat mat folds under is not a gentle process, and the surface around it surges with force. Anything floating nearby gets pushed and rocked by the wake. A table that survived that kind of water movement, with its contents undisturbed, would have had to land very precisely upright on a surface that was itself calming down from a massive disturbance. Both versions of the collapse leave the table's condition looking slightly wrong. It is not impossible, but it is wrong. The physical evidence points in two different directions and refuses to commit to either one. When you look at the facts, you realize the table was not just a piece of wood, but a witness that refuses to tell a consistent story. It sat there on the water as a reminder that the swamp does not just take lives, it erases the context of how those lives ended. The Dial family was gone, and the table was the only thing left to prove they had ever been there at all. In the months following the disappearance of 12 people into the Okefenokee in 1892, the people of Charlton County did something that seems impossible to us now, and that was to do nothing at all. There was no coroner's inquest to determine a cause of death, and no sheriff's report exists in any archive that has survived the passing years. You will find no county-level investigation into these deaths because, in the eyes of the law, dying inside the swamp was not the same thing as dying on solid ground. The interior of that basin had no owner and no jurisdiction that anyone bothered to enforce, which meant that nobody patrolled the water or held any real authority over what happened among the cypress. When the swamp took a life, the event fell into a legal category that the local government simply had no paperwork or procedure to handle. This lack of action was not negligence in the way a modern mind might define it, but rather a reflection of how those 1890s Georgia communities viewed the boundary they lived against. The swamp was a place where they worked and gathered food, yet it was also a territory where the normal guarantees of safety and law did not apply to anyone who entered. You pushed your boat into that water knowing the risks, and the families who lived along the edge understood that if something went wrong in the deep interior, the interior would keep the evidence. The records are silent on what the relatives did in the weeks after the search ended, so we do not know if they begged for a formal inquiry or wrote letters to the men in power. Perhaps they simply grieved in private and accepted the loss as part of the brutal math of living on the edge of a wilderness that gave nothing back. The Dial family eventually fades out of the historical record as completely as the 12 people who rode away that morning, and their disappearance from the archives shows how little room the 19th century made for the sorrow of the poor. If this happened today, the investigation would begin in the Charlton County Courthouse by pulling every land deed and church registry to piece together exactly who was in that party. A modern team would likely bring ground-penetrating sonar into the area where the Dials traveled to search for signs of ancient peat collapses beneath the surface. Some of that geological work has actually been done in the swamp over the years, though it was focused on the shifting nature of the landscape rather than this specific tragedy. When you pull a core sample from the floor of the Okefenokee and read the layers of peat like a historian reads a ledger, you see a record of a place that has been in constant motion for thousands of years. The islands that looked like permanent landmarks to the Dial party in 1892 had already drifted and changed shape dozens of times before any man arrived with a boat or a notebook. Even the channels that local families knew by heart were relatively new features, cut into the earth by old fires and long droughts, and the slow migration of water through rotting organic matter. The interior that the family rode into was not a stable world that suddenly had one bad day, but a dynamic system that had always behaved with a certain level of violence. The federal government finally stepped in during 1937 to establish the Okefenokee National Wildlife Refuge, which drew a formal line around 400,000 acres and placed the entire basin under protected status. Today, your access to that interior is strictly controlled through marked canoe trails and permitted camping on wooden platforms that keep you safely above the treacherous surface. The massive bureaucratic system that was missing in 1892 now exists specifically because we finally understand what this water is capable of doing to the unwary. These modern camping platforms are bolted directly into the heartwood of cypress trees rather than resting on the peat, because the engineers knew the ground itself could never be trusted. The specific part of the interior where the Dial party likely met their end remains largely the same as it was over a century ago. The massive logging operations that once stripped the timber from Billy's Island are long gone, but those crews didn't change the water or find a way to stabilize the floating mats of vegetation. Since the Hebbard lumber crews pulled their equipment out in the 1920s, the Grand Prairie has been slowly returning to its original state, which is not a tamed park, but a wilderness with 30-foot columns of water hidden beneath a thin skin of moss. We can say with a fair amount of certainty that 12 people left the edge of the swamp on a clear morning and never came home again. A search party found a table floating in the black water with a meal still laid out on the wood, but they never found a single body or even a piece of a broken boat. No formal record of this event was written down at the time, so the only documentation we have comes from local stories that were finally recorded decades after the witnesses had passed away. Everything else we think we know is just an inference based on the physical evidence of the landscape. A massive peat collapse is the most plausible explanation we have, especially when you consider the geological history of the basin and the way the ground behaves under pressure. The lingering questions about the floating table and the missing boats do not necessarily disprove this theory, but they do suggest that the collapse happened with a speed and a precision that left no room for survivors. The swamp did not just take 12 lives in 1892. but it also took the sequence of events and the evidence of the struggle. It swallowed the moment of crisis and every small detail that would have allowed us to tell this story with absolute certainty. The table was the only thing that came back, because wood floats, and the swamp had no use for it, while everything else was pulled down into the dark. The Okefenokee is still there, and the interior remains largely unmapped at the ground level, as it continues to rearrange its channels and collapse its islands on a schedule it keeps to itself. People still travel the designated trails and return home safely, because the modern rules are written to respect the nature of the swamp rather than trying to fight against it. But if you ever step off that trail and push your boat into the open prairies, you are floating on the same water the Dial family saw, sitting on a surface that hides 30 feet of nothingness beneath your feet. The ground trembles under your weight, and the truth is that it always has. The swamp never needed a monster or a supernatural mystery to be terrifying, because the physical reality of water and weight was enough. 12 people walked into that landscape, and only a single table ever emerged from the peat that refused to hold them. The water closed over everything else, and those dark ripples have remained still for over a century. If you want to hear more stories like this one, subscribe and share this with someone who won't mind lying awake tonight thinking about a set table floating alone on black water.